So the next thing that we're going to talk about is the transport of carbon dioxide, which is another important transport issue in the blood. Bless you. So compared to oxygen, carbon dioxide is transported in a rather different way. So first of all, carbon dioxide is much more soluble in the plasma. Okay? In case of oxygen, only about 1.5% of oxygen, whole oxygen that circulates, is dissolved in the plasma, compared to 10% of carbon dioxide. Okay? 20% are bound to the globin portion of hemoglobin. Does that make sense what I just said? So if we would represent hemoglobin, like this is the protein portion, this is the heme, okay? So oxygen would be bound here, and CO2 would be bound here to the protein part of it. Does that make sense? So carbon dioxide and oxygen do not compete for the same binding spot, right? And 70% transported as bicarbonate. Now you have to appreciate that bicarbonate, this ion, represents a buffer. Okay, what is the buffer? Can anyone tell me what the buffer is? Generally, when we say a word buffer, what does that mean? A barrier prevents the changes, right? So essentially, this ion prevents changes in acidity. For example, if you add proton to it, the acidification, it will form carbonic acid. Okay? If you will add hydrogen ion to it, it will produce water and carbonate. So it can buffer, it can prevent rapid changes in the pH of the blood. Does that make sense? So that bicarbonate buffer in the blood is extremely important in homeostasis. And it also is important for the transport of carbon dioxide. So this is what happens in the tissue. Let's take a look at each and every step. So first of all, carbon dioxide goes from tissues to the blood and is dissolved in plasma. Is that clear? Just dissolved in the fluid. Second, it enters the plasma and slowly forms carbonic acid, which then dissociates to the proton and bicarbonate. We saw this process at least twice before. Does anyone remember where we saw this reaction? In another organ system. Yes, in digestive. So this reaction produces, that's the sort of a universal reaction that produces acid and base. Okay? Now, acidity, sort of bad. So protons is bound by various plasma proteins. When I say plasma proteins, like you have the protein, the amino acid named, say, glutamate. Glutamate has this group at the end. If it binds protein, it becomes this group. Okay? So it can stably bind protein, preventing acidification of the blood. Does that make sense? Pretty much the same process happens in the red blood cells. So CO2 combines with water, produces carbonic acid, which then dissociates into the bicarbonate ion here and proton. Now this process is fast because it is catalyzed by the enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. The proton here that is formed as the part of the process inside of the red blood cell has to be bound by some protein. What is the most abundant protein in the red blood cell? Hemoglobin. Hemoglobin will bind the proton and form some other entity here. Okay. Now, actually this reaction, the combination, is everything fine there? I hope so. The combination of hemoglobin and the proton will shift the equilibrium of this equation to the right, essentially increasing the unloading. Does that make sense? I want you to think about this. When you pull out hemoglobin from this reaction, you pull it out. That shifts the equation, the equilibrium to the right. Shifts the equilibrium right here. So more oxygen is released from the hemoglobin. Okay. More oxygen is released. Unloading increases. But what actually increases the production of protons in the red blood cell? CO2, right? So increased concentration of CO2 in the tissues will increase the proton production, will increase the unloading of oxygen in the hemoglobin. That's what we call the Bohr effect. And last but not least, CO2 directly binds to hemoglobin and forms carbaminohemoglobin. Does that make sense? Okay. So in a nutshell, CO2 is transported in a plasma, directly dissolved, in the form of carbaminohemoglobin right here, and in the form of bicarbonate ion, either in the red blood cell or in the plasma. So this happens in tissues, right? So this is tissues. In the lungs, in the pulmonary capillaries, in the alveoli, look what happens. CO2 now, its concentration in the plasma is much higher than its concentration in the alveoli. So it would go back, it will diffuse across the respiratory membrane okay? It will diffuse across the respiratory membrane back in the alveolus. That makes sense? Make sense? Now, CO2 from the blood, so bicarbonate and proton will recombine in the pulmonary capillaries, forming carbonic acid, which then will slowly dissociate, forming CO2 and water, and CO2 will diffuse in the alveolus. CO2 will detach away from hemoglobin and diffuse in the alveolus. And finally, high oxygen concentration will push for the binding of oxygen and deoxyhemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin, sorry, releasing proton, which then combines with bicarbonate ion right here. Okay, they will form carbonic acid right here. Carbonic acid will quickly dissociate, producing CO2 and water, okay? And CO2 will diffuse into the alveolus. If you would compare this picture, the lungs, and this, the tissue, they are exactly opposite. Okay? So, in the nutshell, the tissues, you have three major ways for transporting carbon dioxide, which are plasma, carbaminohemoglobin, and bicarbonate ion. In the lungs, CO2 from plasma goes back into the alveolus. CO2 bound to hemoglobin goes back into the alveolus. Bicarbonate ion binds to the proton. So you have the same process in the plasma in the red blood cell, and that produces CO2 here. Does that make sense? This is, and I don't want to scare you or anything, but this is probably the most complicated thing that you can encounter in the respiratory, okay? Now, the Haldane effect is what we have discussed, okay? The higher concentration of CO2, okay, leads to the higher numbers of deoxyhemoglobin, higher unloading, and that actually increases the CO2 transport by the blood. Okay, so essentially higher CO2 concentration in the tissues leads to higher carbaminohemoglobin, increases CO2 transport. Does that make sense? You have to think about it. You have to think about these processes pretty much happening all together. When tissues are metabolically active, CO2 goes up. That increases unloading of oxygen, increases the amount of available hemoglobin, which binds protons. This molecule can readily bind CO2, therefore further increasing CO2 transport in the blood and getting rid of CO2 in tissues faster, bringing it back to the homeostatic condition normally. Does that make sense? I try to come up with an analogy, and I honestly, I can't. Seriously. What is probably the thing that you have to focus the most on? Think about the loading and unloading, where it's going to be the highest, where it's going to be the lowest. And let's talk about different parts. So let's compare tissue and lungs. Tissue. What is the temperature of the tissue? Well, like 100 F, right? What's the temperature in the lungs? The environment, the ambient. Carbon dioxide concentration in the lungs. In the tissue, sorry. In the lungs. Does that make sense? So it shows it, so unloading of oxygen, where it's going to be higher. Yeah. It's warm, it has higher CO2. In the lungs, there's no unloading. There's actually loading. Does that make sense? So try to think in terms of physiology, try to imagine this process is going on back and forth. Okay? Now, bicarbonate is an important buffer system in the blood. Okay? So if there is an excess in the protons, carbonic acid is going to be formed. Okay? And it resists the change in the pH in response to acidosis. If concentration of protons goes down, carbonic acid starts to dissociate and releases protons and maintains the pH in the blood. So by far it's the most important buffer system in the blood. So by the way we breathe, we can alter the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood. Therefore, we can alter the pH. So if breathing is slow and shallow, and the rate at which we exhale CO2 is low, right? So CO2, carbon dioxide, will accumulate in the blood. It will lead to the lower pH. Is that understood? CO2 starts to build up in the blood, and that leads to the lower pH. When the breathing is rapid, we remove CO2 from the blood, okay? pH increases. And when there are certain metabolic alterations, we try to compensate for those alterations by breathing. People who experience ketoacidosis and diabetes, they usually demonstrate rapid breathing, trying to compensate for the acidity of the blood with the CO2 exhaled. Now, what is hyperventilation? Yeah. Essentially, you blow off all of your CO2. When CO2 concentration in the blood drops, what happens to the blood pH? Goes up. So it becomes more basic. When your blood and therefore extracellular fluid becomes more basic, how does it affect nervous system? Generally, what effect does it have on the neurons? When you are very, very stressed, like stressed when you have anxiety, what do you do in terms of breathing? There's an advice. You usually take many deep breaths, like you're scared. What do they give you to breathe in? The bag. You breathe in the bag. Why do you breathe in the bag? So you accumulate CO2, and what happens to the pH of the blood? It drops. So acidic blood, how does it influence neuronal activity? opposite. It actually dampens the neuronal activity. That's why people with the diabetes, severe diabetes, the acidosis, they can develop coma because it suppresses neuronal activity. Now, when you are hyperexcited, okay, I mean not in a good way. They tell you to breathe in the bag. That actually allows you to keep CO2 or maybe even accumulate some to put a damp on the neuronal activity. Yes. It essentially calms you down, yes. Breathing in the bag physiologically calms you down on the very basic level of nervous system functioning. If you will ask someone with a nervous disease, something like epilepsy, to overbreathe, that will stimulate epileptic bout. Hyperventilation of an epileptic stimulates an epileptic bout because it overstimulates the neuron. Basic pH overstimulates the neurons. Now, control of the respiration is in the pons and the medulla. There's a ventral and the dorsal respiratory group, so you can see the ventral here and dorsal here, and the Pontine respiratory center here. Ventral respiratory group sets up the normal breathing rate that is called eupnea. Okay, so essentially neurons excite the diaphragm and intercostal muscles to make a breath. Now, expiratory neurons, that's kind of interesting. They don't inhibit the muscles. They inhibit inspiratory neurons. Okay, so neurons, one set stimulates muscles, another set inhibits the ones that stimulate muscles. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, dorsal respiratory group seems to regulate the breathing rate based on the degree of stretch or chemical composition of the blood. Okay, it's pretty much a controlling organ here that controls ventral respiratory group. Pontine respiratory center, which you can see right here, allows you to make a smooth transition from inspiration to expiration. Okay, it controls more complex breathing patterns. When you, for example, sing or talk, because when you talk, you have to adjust your breathing patterns depending on whether you sit, whether you walk, whether you run. What sets up respiratory rhythm? We don't really know. One of the hypotheses is that there's a pacemaker cells that set up the rhythm, like the ones in the heart, set up the rhythm. Another idea is that there is a reciprocal inhibition of neurons. Something like that. Well, I should say this. Neurons that inhibit each other and essentially regulate breathing rate. If it starts to increase, it will decrease it. If it starts to decrease, they will increase it. Although we don't really know the exact mechanism. Now, why we're discussing this is to establish the factors that affect the breathing rate. The most important contributors here: carbon dioxide, chemoreceptors, oxygen, chemoreceptors, and protons, chemoreceptors. Does that make sense? That allows you, so changing levels of those chemicals in the tissues allow you to modify your breathing pattern. The most potent factor here is carbon dioxide. When carbon dioxide in tissues or in the blood, well, subsequently in the blood, goes up, okay? It is sensed by the chemoreceptors in the brainstem and in the periphery. Does that make sense? It is immediately sensed. Now that increase in CO2 stimulates respiratory centers in the medulla, right here, that stimulate respiratory muscles, that increases ventilation, that increases exhalation of CO2, and concentration of CO2 in the blood is restored. Does that make sense? You see, so when CO2 in the blood goes up, it immediately sensed by chemoreceptors. You start to breathe rapidly, usually deep breath, and you exhale that CO2. Now let me ask you something. If I will start running lights out, what's going to happen to the breathing rate? It'll go up. Everybody agrees on that? Is that hyperventilation? No. Why?
Hyperventilation is getting rid of all the CO2.
It's a mismatch, right? It's a mismatch between the tissue needs. So lungs don't comply with what tissue require. Whether it's a bad way, like hypoxia, or it's like one way hypoxia or another way hyperventilation. Does that make sense? Okay? So I mean, if you exercising and you breathing hard, it's not hyperventilation. Hyperventilation is the lack of compliance. So it leads to hypocapnia, cerebral ischemia. Eventually it will lead to the fainting. But initially it will lead to the overstimulation of neurons. Apnea, cessation of breath, and the CO2 becomes abnormally low. Sometimes happen in obesity people, people who are obese. Oxygen, opposite. So in oxygen, when you have low oxygen levels, okay, in the blood, then it stimulates the ventilation, okay, it increases breathing. But you have to understand that decreased, not extremely, but moderately decreased oxygen levels will have very slight effect on ventilation. The reason for it, you have a lot of oxygen bound to hemoglobin. Make sense? You have a ton of it. So to stimulate ventilation, you have to get a really big drop in the arterial oxygen to increase ventilation. Is that clear? First and foremost, CO2. pH. Well, here's the thing. pH is normally, without any metabolic changes, pH of the blood is linked to the CO2. So if CO2 accumulates in the blood, pH drops. But in some cases, there are metabolic changes that will affect pH levels. For example, lactic acid accumulation or excessive production of ketone bodies. That will drop the pH of blood, leading to the more frequent and deeper breathing. Does that make sense? When you will see someone with ketoacidosis, this person is likely to develop rapid, deep breath, trying to compensate for drop in pH by exhaling CO2. We can present it like this. Dropping pH of the blood, I should say respiratory, but let's stick with breathing centers. Increased frequency and depth of breathing. Ideally, lower CO2, lower pH. Does that make sense? Okay. CO2 is the most important. Okay. Oxygen, only the lower levels. Okay. And pH changes, they work usually through the peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay, not through the central, not in the brain, but in the periphery, in the carotid sinuses and in the aortic arch. Before we get further, when you swim underwater, so you get some air in the lungs and you start to swim, what happens with the oxygen levels in the tissues? Eventually they will, okay? What happens to the CO2 level in the blood? It goes up. Does that make sense? It goes up constantly, okay? Oxygen levels don't decline that fast, but CO2 increases because you don't exhale, okay? So you swim and swim and swim and swim and you don't want to get the breath. You still can swim. If you do it for too much time, what you're gonna do? You're gonna take a breath anyway, right? I mean, you cannot hold your breath indefinitely. Try and do it. Try to suffocate yourself by holding your breath. You will fail, right? Because eventually you will not be able to control that. So at a certain point, your conscious control of respiration becomes your reflexes, the respiratory reflex overcomes it. Does that make sense? So that's why people drown actually. They inhale underwater, water gets in the lungs, they die. Okay? Make sense? That's why people inhale underwater. Because the reflex takes over. Okay? They're actually, I have the paper, the huge review somewhere about physiology of drowning. It's fascinating. There's so many factors. What determines if the person is going to drown or not, like cold or warm water, being submerged, completely submerged, not completely submerged. Fascinating. For instance, like people in Titanic, most of them died not drowning. It was too cold. Now, hypothalamus. It provides some regulation to the breathing patterns. When you gasp, when you feel pain, you gasp. When you are excited, when you're angry, stuff like that. Now, you can voluntarily hold the breath. That's what we just discussed. Okay, so that's cortical control. Okay, but again, as we mentioned, brainstem is going to restore breathing if CO2 increases above the certain level. As I mentioned, you can't suffocate yourself. Okay. Now, irritant reflexes. If you have some kind of irritation in the respiratory passages, the respiratory tract, it will cause an immediate constriction of the passage and expulsion of whatever is there. Did you ever try to hold the cough? Is that hard? Yeah, it's almost impossible. Okay, because you essentially try to control not the skeletal muscle, okay, not the muscle that okay, you can cough, okay, voluntarily, but you try to control the reflex, to overcome the reflex. It's really hard. Okay. Interesting reflex, the hearing brewer reflex, is mediated by the stretch receptors that are located in the pleura, and so in the pleura and in the airways. What happens is when you inhale, pleura stretches and airway stretches. It sends the inhibitory impulse to the respiratory center in the medulla, so inhalation ends. It's not a regulatory mechanism as much as it is a protective mechanism, because you inhale, and technically if you will continue to inhale, lungs are not stretchable to an unlimited extent. So in order not to mechanically damage the lungs, which have a very fine structure and respiratory passages, the hearing brewer reflex allows you to stop inhaling when lungs are stretched enough. That makes sense? It's essentially a safety switch that responds to the lung stretch. Adjustments to the exercise and adjustment to the high altitude. So here's we're going to talk about the exercise adjustment. Interestingly, so when you exercise, your breathing rate goes up. It can go up 10, 20 times. The fascinating fact is that during exercise, concentration of carbon dioxide, oxygen, and pH of the blood, all of it in the blood, remain fairly the same. Doesn't drop that much. Does that make sense? Your local tissue like muscle pH can drop. Muscle oxygen concentration can drop. But systemically, on the overall level, you're not going to experience severe acidosis or systemic hypoxia. Okay? So what changes the pattern of respiration? So you can see, actually it kind of shows you that increased respiration complies with the tissue requirements. That 10 to 20-fold increase in respiration allows you to compensate for all oxygen that your muscle tissue starts to use. Does that make sense? That's why the blood concentrations of CO2 and oxygen and pH of the blood remain the same. Stimulus is mainly psychological, not chemical. What it means is that, look, you know when you're going to start running. You know when you're going to start lifting. You know when you're going to start exercising. And when you start, respiratory centers immediately send signals to the lungs to start breathing harder. Does that make sense? Think about this. You run, I don't know, 100 yards. You finish and you stop. Your breathing goes back to normal very quickly. Really quickly. Mostly because you stopped exercising. Does that make sense? So physiological stimuli like CO2 or oxygen levels, don't really have such an influence on the respiratory rate as psychological or simultaneous activation of the cortical centers that control muscle activity and medullary centers that control respiratory activity. Does that make sense? It's pretty much the same neuronal pathway. When signal goes to the muscles, it also is being sent to the respiratory centers. Does that make sense? So again, I want to highlight it more and more. The major stimulus for increased respiration during exercise is the fact that you are moving, rather than changes in the chemistry of the extracellular fluid. Just the fact that you're moving. Now, lactic acid accumulates in exercise because of the anaerobic respiration. Now, that anaerobic process is essentially a fermentation in the muscles. When your muscle cells switch from normal oxidative respiration to fermentation, comes not from the low oxygen supply to the muscles, comes not from the low oxygen levels in the blood. It comes from the fact that when skeletal muscles, first of all, when they squeeze, when they contract, they squish the blood vessels, so blood supply by itself decreases, becomes intermittent. Second, if the heart cannot pump enough blood to the muscles, it will switch to fermentation. Okay? And if you think about it, look, when you run at the very low pace, can you run for a long time? Yeah, because in this case, the ability of the heart to pump enough blood to the muscles matches to the muscle requirements. However, if you run sprint, you can sprint for, 100 meters, quarter mile, okay? But you can't sprint for extremely long time because lactic acid will accumulate and cause inflammation in the muscle and will cause soreness. Okay, you will also run out of gas because fermentation produces ATP at a much less effective level. That makes sense? So that shows you that it's not oxygen supply, it's not lung insufficiency. It's either inability of heart to pump or intermittent blood supply to the muscles. Okay? So that's adaptation to exercise. Altitude. So if you go above 8,000 feet, it may, not necessarily will, but may cause the acute mountain sickness. Almost guaranteed if you go to, if you fly from here to the top of Mount Everest, you will probably die right away. Not only because you freeze, you will freeze to death, but also because you will suffocate. Okay? That makes sense? So, when atmospheric pressure drops and oxygen levels drop, it causes the shortness of breath, most obvious, and dizziness. Okay? Lack of oxygen supply will cause dizziness and actually may cause fainting. So that eventually will stimulate the blood flow to the brain and to the lungs in an attempt, the ill-fated attempt, to pick up more oxygen in the lungs and deliver more oxygen to the brain. Right? And abruptly increased blood flow may cause an edema, brain edema and pulmonary edema. Now, in order to avoid this, we have to adapt. If you would read the memoirs of famous climbers, people who went to Mount Everest, they arrive to Kathmandu in Nepal, they spend some time in the city, they go to base camps. And base camps gradually become more and more elevated above the sea level, right? And they spend several days at each base camp, not because they're lazy, not because they want to have a drink with their friends, but because they have adapted to the new elevation. So it means the chemoreceptors become more responsive to carbon dioxide when oxygen levels decline. Okay? So they kind of adapt to the lower oxygen levels. Okay? Minute ventilation has to increase. Normal minute ventilation. Okay? Decreased availability of oxygen in the blood will stimulate erythropoietin, and that will lead to the slow increase in red blood cells numbers. Now, ideally, of course, you kind of travel to the first base camp, spend a month there, go to the second, spend a month there. So it makes for a very, very long trip. Professional mountain climbers spend less time, of course, but they carry oxygen tanks with them. Not huge ones. It's not like this thing that they hold behind them. It's a smaller, but they still help to survive with that little oxygen on the top of the world. Okay, and if you think how much they have to carry, you know, when first time I heard about Reinhold Messner, who was the first person who reached the Mountain Everest, the peak, by himself. Of course, not from the very bottom, from the last base camp. I thought, what's the deal? Then I read the part of his memoirs. That's the deal. You really have to measure what you carry in terms of food, supplies, and everything. Now, the pathologies of the respiratory system include most common are chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and emphysema. So COPD is pretty much, emphysema is the type of COPD, okay? Very common disease is the chronic bronchitis. It's essentially a chronic inflammation of the respiratory passages. It can be caused by the infection, it can be caused by the inhalation of toxins, it can mostly smoking. Okay, smoking is actually probably the most important risk factor for any lung disease. So in chronic inflammation of the respiratory passages, the amount of mucus that is produced increases, right? And that clogs up the arteries, and that leads to hypoventilation, hypoxemia, and acidosis, inability to exhale enough CO2. That make sense? In case of emphysema, alveoli become larger due to the disruption of the walls. Emphysema is very common in people who are constantly exposed to environmental pollutants. Well, smokers, mine workers, people who live in polluted cities. At some point, folks in China joke that it doesn't really make any difference whether you smoke in Shanghai or Beijing or not. So on a bad day, it's worse. And actually, lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and emphysema that come from air pollution in China pose probably comparable threat to the public health as does smoking. Because as far as I remember, China in percentage is the first country in the world in percentage of adult population that smokes. Second place is proudly occupied by Russians. We have a lot of people who smoke. It's very popular. Okay. The good thing is that we die because of alcoholism earlier than we die from lung cancer. So, in case of emphysema, the walls of alveoli collapse, alveoli become larger, the surface area of the respiratory membrane, okay, decreases. Respiratory membrane decreases, Okay, lungs become less elastic, so lung compliance decreases. When lung compliance decreases, we have to put more energy to breathing, so it becomes tiring to breathe. We have to hyperinflate the lungs, which flattens the diaphragm. Okay, and flattened diaphragm becomes less effective in changing the volume of the thoracic cage and becomes less effective in the ventilation. Okay, also in case of emphysema, pulmonary capillaries become damaged, so resistance of the pulmonary circuit increases, right? Right ventricle becomes hypertrophied. It has to pump against the higher resistance. So after load, the pulmonary circuit increases, right? And it actually may lead to the congestive heart failure in the long-term perspective. So as you can see, the complications from smoking or inhaling pollutants go farther than just lung cancer, and just lung cancer sounds really, really bad. Okay. Chronic bronchitis, irritants. I was a child, like 13. One very joyful pulmonologist diagnosed me with a chronic bronchitis. I was not aware of the true meaning of that notion. I mentioned it to my aunt, who is a pediatric physician. She said, "Dude, you don't have chronic bronchitis. People die from it in like 5-10 years. So forget it." I did have frequent respiratory infections, and I lived in a city which we call Russian Houston. So we have a lot of space technologies there, and not only we have some mission control centers in there, like the same that you can the NASA, the Kennedy Center in Houston, pretty much the same stuff as in my hometown. But we also have a lot of manufacturing facilities that actually make rockets, engines, and fuel. So respiratory problems were like a common thing. We didn't have, at a certain point, my childhood doctor told my mom, "Look, we don't have a single child that has no respiratory problems in our city." Then in 91, Soviet Union collapsed. The last thing that people started to think about was space. All those companies stopped making anything. The public health benefited from it, actually. The air in the city improved significantly. Now it gets worse again. Okay, so pollution, even if it's not like a smoke and that awful smoke, it have some subtle effect leading to the inflammation, obstruction of the airways, and actually frequent infections, whether infections of the lungs or infections of the respiratory passages. What is the ultimate disease that causes ultimate accumulation of mucus in the lungs? Anyone knows? No, it's a syndrome. Okay, pneumonia is inflammation in the lungs. There is a genetic disease that causes massive accumulation of mucus everywhere, including lungs. Cystic fibrosis. In cystic fibrosis, patients accumulate a vast amount of mucus, and it traps microbes, right? Good. Well, not that good, because they can't remove all that mucus. And those microbes, mostly Pseudomonas aeruginosa, cause pretty much chronic pulmonary infections. And those patients have to spend the rest of their not very long life on antibiotics. It's a really, really sad disease. Okay. So depending on the strength of the respiratory drive, some of the patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease called pink puffers that can ventilate the sufficient level, maintaining normal concentrations, gases in the blood. They're usually thin, while the stocky patients called blue bloaters that cannot maintain the normal respiratory drive and become hypoxic. Okay, treatment for COPD is supportive. There's no cure. Okay, anti-inflammatory drugs, the bronchodilators, oxygen tanks. You can see people walking around with oxygen tanks. Okay, asthma is the example of reversible obstructive pulmonary disease. When a person has an asthma attack, usually the result of inflammation. So that's why it can be triggered. So think about this. Allergies trigger asthma, and allergy is the inflammation, as we discussed. Infections, different viral infections, especially viruses, can trigger asthma. Things like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus, RSV, which you probably have heard about, triggers asthma frequently. When inflammatory mediators are released, it causes constriction of the bronchioles and problems with breathing. You shouldn't treat asthma lightly. My kid's classmate, actually, no, he was 1 year younger. He died of asthma in his sleep. The guy had quite severe form of asthma. He had an outbreak when he was sleeping, and he essentially suffocated when he was asleep. It's really awful. So, I mean, I try to project it to your future clinical experience. I mean, when a patient comes to you with asthma, just don't think, oh, get Ventolin, okay, and you'll be fine. It depends on the severity. It should be carefully managed. Couple more diseases that are associated with lungs: TB, tuberculosis. We talk about it a lot in the microbiology. This picture nicely shows you different X-rays of patients with tuberculosis, like really, really disseminated ones. You can see the white infiltrations, more localized lesions in the lungs. It's caused by the bacterial infection. Some estimates suggest that 1/3 of the world population is positive, it's infected. But in most people, it's an inactive form. It's not even noticeable, and you're going to live a long life and not even knowing that you have TB. When it becomes active in its lung manifestations, it's hard to breathe. Frequently, it progresses to cause blood in the sputum. There's an idea actually that tuberculosis was brought in Europe partially by the migration from the east to the west, probably in the last maybe couple of centuries. For a long time, without antibiotics, the prognosis was always fatal. Depends on how long. Although it may become chronic. If the immune system can control it, it may become like low grade. Now we treat it with antibiotics, unfortunately, because these antibiotics, this microbe develops resistance very, very quickly, extremely quickly. Now we have so-called TDR, totally drug-resistant strains. I mean, they resistant to every single antibiotic that we know. Physicians have to combine them, increase doses, and it's months of treatment. Okay, it's really a pain in the butt treating TB. And respiratory, the most affected populations are prisoners. Actually any place where there's accumulation of folks. In states it's easier because it's so controlled. You have to do the TB test like everything. You go to nursing classes. For nursing you have to do the TB test.